Welcome, everyone. We're super excited about this little presentation that we're about to receive and some very valuable information that we as the staff of Region 5 Development Commission and the North Central Economic Development Association found fascinating and wanted to learn a little bit more about. So we're fortunate to have Kelly Asche here. In a moment, we'll introduce him. Wanted to give you a little bit of context for this information in that we are talking about the 5 counties in central Minnesota being Cass, Crow Wing, Morrison, Todd, Wadena. And those counties encompass not only the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwa, the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwa, but also the Army camp, the Camp Ripley Army Camp. And our population of 165,000-ish should be interested in this information and how it pertains to our ability to provide economic prosperity for all folks in our region, which is one of our core values and part of our mission. So with that, I'll let Stacy Headley introduce our guest today, and we'll dive right into the presentation, and excited about it.
Right, so we have Kelly Asche from the Center for Rural Policy and Development. His education includes Masters of Public Policy from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. Work experience, after receiving his master's in public policy at the Humphrey School, Kelly was hired on as a research associate at the Center for Rural Policy and Development and works from his home in New London, Minnesota, where he is also a member of the City Council. Kelly's work at the Center for Rural Policy and Development is focused on rural workforce shortages and rural migration patterns, busting myths related to the rural narrative and researching policy issues related to economic development, healthcare, and agriculture. So, Kelly, we will turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen here. I'm going to start out just with a few slides about the Center for Rural Policy and Development. In case you are unfamiliar with us, this won't take too long. We were actually created by the state legislature here in Minnesota back in the late 90s with the purpose of providing research related to rural Minnesota. So as they were talking about policies, they would hear, legislators would hear a lot from kind of metro-based organizations with data in their hands, but found that they kind of got a little bit more anecdotal evidence from their rural constituents. And so they set up us to kind of try and give some a little bit more research power and a little bit more data power behind some of the rural policies that they were discussing. There's 19 board members at the Center for Rural Policy and Development, made up of mostly folks from rural Minnesota of various industries. Here's our staff, our massive staff of 4. We're small, and we all live and work out of our homes. We're a virtual office. Like I said, my name is Kelly Asche. I'm a center research associate in New London, Minnesota. My boss is the director of research and operations. She's out of Mankato. That's Marnie Werner. And then our president and CEO, Julie Tesh, she's living at her family farm in Waldorf, Minnesota, which is outside of Waseca. And we did hire a contract researcher just recently, Whitney Oakes from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, just graduated, currently living in St. Paul, but attempting to make her way up to the Taylor's Falls region. So then we can again go back to saying all of our staff live in rural Minnesota. So hoping to get there. We have just recently released our most recent 3 reports. Last one was by Whitney, Shifting Energy Infrastructure in Rural Minnesota, really discussing why this shift and push towards more renewable energy sources among our particularly energy cooperatives is a little bit of a challenge, and why they're finding it challenging to do that work. I just released a report looking at the rise of online sales or e-commerce and what kinds of impacts that's having on rural tax revenues, particularly property taxes from commercial properties and local option sales taxes. And then Whitney did another one quite a few months ago, doing some focus groups and interviews with rural kind of county administrators and city administrators, talking about some of their efforts and some of the challenges they face when trying to connect with immigrant and refugees populations within their counties and in their communities, and what outreach looks like and what are some of those challenges, particularly during the pandemic, to kind of lay out some of those issues. Really interesting report. We have quite a bit coming up. We actually have quite a few in the queue right now, so keep an eye out for us. The first one, county reliance on property taxes from ag land. Ag land values have shot through the roof, and that has also meant additional revenue for county budgets and kind of what that looks like. Ruralness and the challenges for EMS agencies. That's one I'm working on, be coming out in the next month. My boss Marnie did an environmental scan of solutions in childcare. Legislators were really interested to learn kind of what's going on in the community and how can they better support some of those initiatives that are happening. We're also doing impacts career and technical education has on high school migration patterns. That's going to be a few months yet. And then some other ones you can see that we have coming up here through the rest of our fiscal year, which runs through June. If you are interested, go to our website, ruralmn.org. We also have a YouTube channel where we put research videos, webinars, and all types of things on there, as well as a podcast if you're interested in that sort of thing, Center of Everywhere. We bring in a lot of different guests to talk about different issues and research that's being worked on in rural Minnesota. So it's really interesting. You can check us out on Spotify and iTunes. Okay, so let's get to the nitty gritty here. We got a few things to go over. Before launching into kind of the cost of living type stuff, I really wanted to build some context around why we're talking about this and the importance of how this relates to workforce shortages and people recruitment. I've been doing this research for quite a while now, particularly the workforce shortages and the need for more workers in rural areas. And that's been ongoing for a long time. So I'm going to go through some of that data right now. So like I said, I've probably been looking at these numbers since 2015, looking at workforce job openings and workforce and labor force participation rates. And when we first started looking at that, legislators and other rural leaders came up to us and said, God, we hear a lot about, the need for workers in the metro areas. We see some good data, but what's that look like? Is that translating into rural areas as well? And so they kind of set forth the goal for us to put some numbers to some of the things they were hearing. So real quickly, just to kind of provide some foundation here in Minnesota, because, we're Minnesota people, we live in Minnesota, we kind of tend to lose perspective on how good it's been going here in Minnesota. And so let's talk about that a little bit. Top 5 lowest unemployment rate almost continuously since the 70s. Top 5 highest labor force participation rates. So even though we continue to kind of hear narratives about, there's not enough people working and blah, 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 just keep in mind, we're still one of the highest in the entire country as far as labor force participation rate, even in rural areas. We're almost always a top performing state during every recession since the Great Depression. We have the 5th most diverse economy. I think that one's important because you do not have the 5th most diverse economy in Minnesota if you do not have rural Minnesota. Rural Minnesota is what brings that diversity into the economy that would not exist otherwise. So what's kind of threatening all of this, or why is this such a big issue? Well, the biggest reason is lack of people. So the labor force growth has been decreasing for 2 decades, and most significantly, it's been decreasing in rural areas. We're terrible at keeping our youth, and that is not just a rural Minnesota issue. That is a Minnesota issue. The Twin Cities is just as is pretty terrible at it as well. And we have and this is more federal policy, but immigration policy has been devastating to the workforce in Minnesota as far as how many refugees we're allowed to bring in, and just some of the policies around immigration that a lot of our rural areas have relied on in order to increase their workforce. We're not going to dive into that in that presentation, but it needs to be brought up because it continues to be an issue. So all of this has meant there's a fundamental shift taking place in economic development away from the old traditional way of we need to bring jobs in order to bring people. And now we've shifted over to we have the jobs, we still don't have people, right? So the whole economic development kind of transition, even though jobs are still important, don't get me wrong there, we need to talk about people and how we bring people to rural areas. And that means how we talk about ourselves. This is the job vacancy rate using the Deeds job vacancy survey. This is every planning region in the state. And then I did include EDR 5. You guys are the purple line there. And the job vacancy rate is the number of quarterly job vacancies as a percentage of the total filled jobs in the region. And we consider about a 3% job vacancy rate to be relatively healthy. That means you're having plenty of jobs come in that are providing opportunity for your people, while at the same time, employers probably have enough people applying for those jobs to have a competitive labor pool. Anything above 3% gets more and more challenging in order to fill those jobs, but also means there's increasing opportunity for workers in that region. As you can see, I'll use EDR5 North Central. You guys are at about 4.9%. This is 2020 data. I'll take a look at 2021 here in just a second. But in 2020 is 4.9%, so about 5%, 2 percentage points above what we consider to be healthy. That's really high. You'll see actually in 2018, you guys are right around 7%. That's insane. That's a lot. That means there's a lot of jobs, probably not a lot of people applying for those jobs. Great opportunity, but employers might be a little bit feeling the pinch a little bit. Again, it dropped down a little bit in 2020. These fluctuate a little bit, but what you're tending to see is, the 7-county metro, they get a lot of kind of press for a lot of the jobs and workforce shortages, but actually the job vacancy rate has been highest outside of the 7-county metro since dating back to about 2010. And so rural areas or greater Minnesota has been facing this issue for significantly longer than the 7-county metro, and to a higher degree. We don't have the full year for 2021 job vacancy rate. So this is just the first half. So remember 2020 is when the pandemic started, everything shut down. And then right around that New Year's, when everything kind of popped back open again, and you started hearing murmurings about job vacancy rates. Yeah, these were the numbers, which are out of sight crazy high. So we're talking near 10% in almost every single region outside of the 7-county metro, except for Southwest. And again, Southwest was the least impacted by COVID and the pandemic because they had so many of businesses that were considered essential and stayed open and remained open. And so they just didn't see that fluctuation as much. But again, this is crazy high. And I'm sorry I don't have EDR5. Unfortunately, DEED stopped providing the data at the EDR level. And something, go ahead and talk to DEED about. I know I've been kind of bugging them a little bit that we need to get that data back because it's really important. But we don't know what it was in EDR5, but knowing that Central is 8.4% and even Northeast is right around 10%, you guys are somewhere in there for sure. So a lot gets made about wages, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in the cost of living stuff, but it is worth mentioning that business, one of the narratives that comes out is like, well, if you want people to work, then increase your wages. Well, to some extent, employers have been doing that. And so this is the median wages of job vacancies in each region, and I included EDR5 again. The EDR5 only goes to 2019. Again, the data stopped collecting the data at that level starting in 2020. But you can see it's 1455. And one of the main narratives I make of this chart is that starting back in 2005, you'll see there was a pretty big gap between the 7-county metro and all the other regions. So the median wages, that gap, and I think today people still think that gap exists, but actually the largest increases in wages have occurred outside of the 7-county metro to the point where that gap is closed considerably, significantly, actually. And what this tells us is two things. One, the increase in wages is minimum wage policy. Like that is going to have an impact on wages. There's just no doubt about that. You increase the minimum wage, wages in general start to go up. But this is also significantly impacted by the fact that rural areas have been struggling with workforce shortages for a little bit longer to a greater extent than the 7-county metro. And so they have been increasing wages in order to attract workers. So it's worth mentioning. And again, EDR5 is about 1455, kind of at the lower end of a lot of the regions. And again, that's 2019. By 2020, did it increase to 15? Maybe, it's hard to say. Central itself is at 1512. And Northeast is, I always kind of throw you guys in the Central Northeast region because I feel like that's a good balance for you guys. 1442. So yeah, definitely at the lower end of things. But I will say overall, the data is pretty clear when it comes to job vacancies. The pressure to fill job vacancies in greater Minnesota is at or exceeds levels experienced in the Twin Cities. The gap in wages has narrowed. A significantly larger number of job vacancies are full-time. Even though that per share of job vacancies may decrease a little bit, there's such a higher and larger number of job vacancies that it just dwarfs whatever was before that. A significantly larger number of job vacancies are offering health insurance benefits. And the other thing that I think is worth mentioning is we see a lot of people try to equate job skill requirements or experience requirements as some sort of indicator as to the level of skill needed for that job. And when we talked to employers, we did a whole bunch of interviews around the state. What we found out is that a lot of employers actually use that as a lever to kind of either shrink or grow their applicant pool. So one example I'll give is like construction. So during the Great Recession, the job requirements for construction was really high. They want, because construction workers a lot of them were laid off. There were a lot in the pool, and there weren't that many jobs available. The jobs that were available, they said, hey, you need a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree. You need 10 years of experience. You need all this stuff. But now that construction is booming and they can't find a construction worker, there are no requirements. You'll see a lot more stuff on the job training. We will pay for your training, right? Like they got rid of all the requirements. And so we found that across a lot of the occupations and industries is that job requirements was used as a lever for applicant pool rather than a gauge for what was actually needed to fill that job. So probably wondering what COVID-19 impacts. This is back in 2020, so this isn't maybe totally relevant anymore. But when we dug into the data right when the pandemic began and as it was going, you had a lot of people that were laid off at the time. What we did see is that for the first time in a long time, there was a pool of workers to engage, and they were particularly in these 3 occupations, not surprising, right? Food prep and serving related, sales and related, and office and administrative support. There are still significant workforce shortages in essentially every other occupation. And we are showing that the projections are, this is a long-term issue, probably not a short-term problem, that you're going to see workers on this end be in a pool, and yet we'll need all of this. And so one of the questions is, how do you try to bridge this gap, right? And I think a lot of workforce development organizations are kind of thinking about that right now. And I would argue even employers are thinking about that right now. And this is a labor force participation. So this is an index to 2010 for each region in EDR5. So 2010, if you had this number of workers, what does essentially the number of people participating in the labor force look like in 2021 compared to 2010? And you'll see in EDR5, it's about 3% less people participating in the labor force than in 2010. So that's 12 years ago now. So there's a reason why employers are feeling a little bit of a pinch because we've had a lot of people drop out of the labor force. We've had a lot of people retire. Northern Minnesota, this in Northeast, and I would argue the northern part of Central, this was the big story. Everybody's like, oh, people are just lazy. They don't want to work. It's like, no, we have an older workforce, a lot of them retired, and a lot of people had to make decisions based on life circumstances. The research was pretty clear that due to childcare, schooling, all kinds of issues, that people had to make a choice of, hey, one of us spouse stay home, take care of the kids, or do what you need, and I'll continue to work. And I didn't include a slide on that, but I do have some data that looks at one of the larger drops in participation in the workforce was among female workers, female employment. So something to keep in mind as we think about how we engage workers that maybe have left the workforce and what that might look like. Okay, so that's the data on workforce shortages. I want to talk a little bit about people recruitment. And we did a 4-part series. One was the data, and the remaining 3 parts on workforce shortages was the different ways in which we try to fix this. What is the 3 kind of ideas and solutions. And the first one was people recruitment. So how do we bring people into our communities, into our regions? The second one was, how do we engage populations that have high barriers to employment? This includes people with criminal background history, people in poverty, things like that. And then the third one was, how do we engage our high schoolers to get them to understand that there's actually great opportunities here? We're only going to focus on the people recruitment one. If you're interested in the others, go ahead and check out our website or email me. I'd be happy to provide those. But let's talk about resident recruitment and retention. I think to kind of provide a little bit of foundation, I call it rural envy, but if anybody's not familiar with Greater MSP, it's this organization that essentially works on promoting the Twin Cities, what it's like to live there, what it's like to work there, what opportunities are available. Look at our nightlife, look at our housing, like this kind of centralized hub in which a lot of things are gathered. So people that are interested in moving to the region have it all at their fingertips in a really centralized space. I call it rural envy because when we first looked at resident recruitment and we went out and interviewed economic development organizations, almost every single one were like, God, I wish we had something like Greater MSP. That was really a common thing over and over and over again. And so that's why I say rural envy, not in a negative way, but You know what I mean? So in rural areas, when we talk about resident recruitment, it's based on Ben Winchester work and Neil Lynchide's work at the University of Minnesota Extension. You know, a lot of folks get wrapped up into this idea of how do we keep our youth, when rural resident recruitment actually looks a little bit differently. And it's based on this idea that instead of trying to keep our younger people who do leave our rural areas, how do we attract and retain and recruit households in which we do see trends of them moving into our rural regions. And those are like the 30 to 49-year-olds. This map here is just one of the maps that looks like in-migration from of 30 to 34-year-olds across various across Minnesota by county. And you can see the dark green means there's more in-migration into those counties in that particular age group. And you can see most of rural Minnesota sees significant in-migration in that age group. And that trend kind of continues for, you know, from the 35 to 39, 40 to 44, it just kind of keeps moving forward. And that's what people recruitment and some of these initiatives are really based on, this kind of trend. There are various trends. I took this from the University of Minnesota Extension, who's doing a lot of work around this. And this is their slide kind of outlining just a few different initiatives that are occurring across Minnesota. Some of these don't exist anymore. They kind of started up and petered out. Some are living hard and doing well. But it's this Marketing Hometown America down in, this, in the bottom of the chart here that they're kind of playing around with this idea of like, all right, what does a promotional campaign really look like in rural areas? Now, one of the interesting things, and again, this goes back to that transition we're seeing in economic development, is why are people migrating to rural areas? We're seeing this trend of 30 to 49-year-olds come in. And again, this is work done by Extension. They did some focus groups to try and help answer this question. A lot of folks thought jobs, right down here in the bottom right, would be like the #1 reason. It's kind of been the economic development I would say theory that's been holding a lot of the strategies together, is if we have jobs, people will come. But what they found through focus groups is that actually these first three were much more important. Affordable housing, small class sizes, and then this kind of bigger theme of quality of life, right? And if any of you have seen Ben Winchester give his presentation, you probably know this stuff well, but quality of life is kind of this idea of a whole bunch of things that people said under that theme. So it could have been slower pace of life. I like to eat around the dinner table. I want to be able to hunt more, have easy access to the outdoors. Those types of things were considered quality of life. I kept jobs in here because even though jobs for, I'm going to say like non-immigrant and non-refugee populations, jobs was not as important as maybe we thought. And it kind of flew in the face of our idea, except immigrant and refugee populations in those focus groups, it comes up quite a bit higher. And so I think it's important to kind of understand that there's a little bit of nuance and a little difference there in terms of why people are choosing to move to certain areas. And that might kind of change what people recruitment and retention might look like. University of Minnesota Extension, they did a rural survey they sent out. They got 1,600 responses, which was really, really good. A couple of pieces that I thought was interesting from that. Whoops, sorry, folks. 25% of the households have lived in the community before. That's much less than I think a lot of folks would consider. I think we always talk about it as people moving back to where they grew up, but that isn't necessarily the case. It's important to understand that people are moving into a community for a lot of different reasons. It might have been because they visited there or they traveled there, or, you know, for whatever reason, they just got tied to that area. 30% of them said they respondents moved primarily for a job. And only 25% of households have children, which was quite a bit low, but it's important to remember that a significant higher percentage of them were planning on having children. And so they moved beforehand. So that's key to keep in mind when thinking about this. So another reason I like talking about this, particularly with RDCs and kind of regional type organizations, is I think a lot of, I'll say I'm city council member here in New London. I live in New London, and I totally understand, like, I'm a New Londonite. I do not want to think about anything outside my region. I'm going to have every darn thing I want in this town. And I think it's important to understand that that's probably, one, not realistic, and two, it's not how a lot of folks are approaching their living area, right? So it's important to really think regionally. How do we all fit into this puzzle in which people are living their daily lives? And so this exercise, again, taken from Ben Winchester, I do that because he's done a lot of this stuff around people recruitment. But I found this exercise he does really, really intriguing. And the way he talks about it is he'll talk to somebody and be like, all right, put a star where you live, and then put an X where you work. And that X, well, nowadays might be right on the star due to COVID, but also could be, within 30, 45 miles from that star. And then they ask, all right, draw a circle around where you shop or eat. And typically that circle is 30 to 45, maybe even 60 miles around where they live. And then they say, draw a circle around where you play or hang out. And that circle gets even bigger, right? So this idea that our community needs to be everything for every single household member isn't necessary. And it's why a lot of people recruitment initiatives are really focused on being regional rather than just community. And that's important, I think, as we continue to kind of discuss these ideas and strategies. I used Upper Minnesota Valley's RDC because I had access to it. Get Rural MN, their campaign that they're doing down there with the prairiewaters.com. I really liked just kind of how they laid out. It was a really easy graphic for me to use, because it brought in like, all right, we need to figure out how to have a hub for housing, a hub for employment opportunities, a hub for things to do, and a hub for family essentials. Like, how do we get this all into one spot? And this really then keys into some of the complexity behind this, right? So the recruitment challenges are you need to build a network from scratch. So looking back on that Upper Minnesota Valley piece is you're talking to not only employers, but also landlords, also real estate agents, also county parks and city parks. And, you're pulling a lot of different people, agency organizations, and for-profit companies together to try and get this combined. That's really, really challenging. And then the second question is, who's responsible for that? Is this a tourist thing? Is this an EDA thing? Is it a county thing? It's a question that everybody's kind of just winging it right now. It's like, oh, do you have capacity to do it? You're doing it. It doesn't really matter. But at some point, that question does need to get answered. The third challenge is a negative narrative and perceptions. So there's not only trying to change the narrative of somebody that maybe doesn't live in a rural area, changing their perception of what it actually is like to live in a rural area. But there's also our own community. I have found just in my work here in New London, pretty amazing how people perceive their own community. I love New London. I find it surprising there's people in New London that don't love living in New London, but it exists. And boy, that's a tough nut to crack because once they have their perception set, and they were set for a certain reason, turning that around can be kind of hard. And then the fourth thing is here, just the diversity of skill set required for these initiatives, because you need graphic designers, website designers, but you also need marketing people and people that can be in public speaking. It's just organizing skills, run meetings. Like, that's a lot to ask. And so this isn't just a one person, yeah, you do my people recruitment stuff. It's like, no, this is going to require a kind of full effort. So it's important to understand. So my last slide on this is just the policy implications of this. I think for county commissioners that might be listening to this, or anybody that kind of writes policy, is to understand that there's pretty significant implications here. So the old kind of job recruitment retention, where it was tax incentives, infrastructure investments, and the focus on labor force, although probably still important, those strategies are kind of, they've been there a long time, and they've been well oiled and well greased, where a lot of things that maybe you thought were kind of, oh, frou-frou, we don't worry about that, that's not in our wheelhouse, such as housing programs, childcare, visitor strategies, current resident engagement, natural amenities. These types of things now are economic development. And that's a pretty big change. That's a pretty big change in people's ideas about how to move forward on things. So I think for anybody that's listening to this, you got to start taking these things seriously if you want to take people recruitment seriously. And if you want to take your employer seriously, who are actively trying to find workers to fill their spots. So, okay, that sets us up for cost of living. So this whole conversation stems from this idea of the rural narrative, right? So the idea of workforce shortages, why don't you pay more? Trying to overcome the narrative like, well, I could move there, but the wages are so low. But then there's people in rural areas who be like, yeah, but the cost of living is so low, right? And there wasn't a lot of data to kind of back up any of this stuff. It was just kind of being flung around. And so we just kind of wanted to add a little bit of foundation to this, kind of be like, all right, where are we at? Are wages competitive? We can't just compare wages to wages. We need to compare what the cost of living is as well, because that actually gives us the competitive wages narrative. So luckily, DEED, one of the few economic development organizations in the entire country, actually does a cost of living calculator. And I'm going to go through this a little bit. Keep in mind, yes, of course, these are estimates. Yes, of course, some of these are not perfect, but it's the best we have. And I think paints at least a picture of what the cost of living is in our counties across the state. There's a lot here. Their methodology behind this is really fascinating and quite good. I don't want to dig too much into this, but just so you know, each of these categories has a methodology and a data source that they're using to collect this information. So food, housing, healthcare, transportation, childcare, the net taxes and other necessities, they're using all kinds of things to draw into this. And just from what I've seen, or I had to read it and enjoyed it, but it's good. It's complicated, it's robust, and it's probably the best we could come up with. And so kudos to DEED for putting that together. But I just want to give you an idea of all the different categories that went into this. So I kind of wanted to just say, you know, if we, when you do the cost of living calculator, it does it based on your family composition. So the charts I'm going to show you, this is our family. It's a 3-person household. Number of workers is 1 full-time and 1 part-time. A number of children is 1 under the age of 5. So the child will need childcare. And the ages are 19 to 50 of adults, just so we know. So that means for the cost of living categories, how they calculate it is that it's a 2-bedroom house. Childcare is part-time, which I know. I've gotten plenty of feedback that that doesn't exist. I completely understand. But it's, again, the best we could do with our calculator. Food, just what they use, it's a moderate cost plan from the USDA, 3-person household. Transportation is 1 car, travel to work, includes travel to work and travel to purchase necessities, and it includes travel to spiritual locations and all kinds of stuff. And again, yes, I know, 1 car, probably unrealistic. There aren't too many 1-car households in rural Minnesota. Other necessities is actually the proportion of food and housing costs. That's how they calculate that. Healthcare, they use employee contributions from private employer-based health insurance, including out-of-pocket expenses. And then the taxes are simulated. And you don't need to know how that works because it's complicated, but it's pretty good. Okay, so let's take a look. This is the map of the hourly wages needed to meet the cost of living. This is 2020, the most recent data we have that DEED has. The darker the blue is the higher hourly wage needed to meet the cost of living. I did an outline of Region 5 to kind of give you a sense. And what's interesting, right? Like, no surprise, Twin Cities Metro, pretty high. You know, you're talking $20 to $25 an hour needed to meet the cost of living. As we go west, in particular, the lower it gets, and it gets closer to that $14 an hour. The one interesting thing about Region 5 is you guys are right on that cusp. You're not super high, but you're not super low either. You're right in that transition area. And this is what's really interesting about the cost of living is we have found consistently the Central Lakes and just north of the Twin Cities is kind of one of the highest cost of living combined with the wages that you get. So we'll get into that in just a little bit, but it's kind of interesting. If you're out in Western Minnesota, you're doing, you know, the cost of living is quite a bit lower. That's guaranteed. Oh, so yeah, and then I did it by a planning region here, just to kind of get a sense of what this looks like. And you can see here, 7 county Minneapolis. So all those counties together is about $21 an hour to meet the cost of living. Everybody else is down here, except for Central. EDR 5, you guys are kind of in the middle of everything, about $16 an hour, according to the cost of living calculator. Southeast, 1652, Central, 1786. So you guys are kind of right in here. Definitely not the lowest in the cost of living. That comes in Southwest and Northwest, kind of the western side of the state. You'll see that quite a bit lower. I broke down each category to kind of give you a sense of, okay, where are we low and where are we high? And the top few things you'll notice right away is that childcare is the big kind of separator between 7 county Metro, which is this red dot here at about $750 a month versus everybody else, which is below 500. And I know that probably is changing rather significantly now. So this, you might see this gap close quite a bit. And there's two things to this that I think is a little bit interesting. One, that it's changing, and two, I think one could argue that these low monthly costs is also probably a reason why we don't have any childcare in rural Minnesota, right? Like we cannot. One, I don't know if, can we afford it? And two, we're not paying enough for childcare to be, a legit business. And so that kind of an interesting thing right there. Food is about the same, healthcare about the same. Housing is the other big one. This continues to be the big difference maker between 7-county metro and most of, I'd say most of greater Minnesota, but in particular metro versus rural. There's this, my wife and I, we moved to New London for many reasons, but one of the reasons because we wanted a house, and we knew like I just wasn't going to spend that much on a house when we were living in St. Paul at the time. And that was a big driving force. For EDR5 is pretty low right now. Whether you guys believe that to be true or not, I don't know, but that's where you guys are at. It's kind of a big gap between 7-county metro and everybody else. Oh, sorry. I got this magic mouse from Apple, and it's brand new, and I hate it. You touch it and it just moves. Other is again, a little bit of a difference. Taxes is quite a bit different. Again, this is property taxes and income taxes. That's going to make the difference there. Obviously, if you own a lake cabin, you may think otherwise, but for most everybody else, it's pretty significant. And then transportation is actually, that's where EDR5 is the highest out of everybody. Transportation was right around, getting near $1,000 a month, and everybody else was significantly lower. So that's how those categories work. So now what we want to do is we want to compare those costs of living to the wages that are provided. And essentially we're going to try and see, do the wages meet the cost of living at all? I think I provide, so I provide an example here. This is healthcare support, kind of a big one. A lot of jobs available in healthcare support, a lot of conversation around, well, does healthcare support occupations pay enough, right? So what this is then is the median wages of healthcare support jobs using occupational employment statistics from DEED as a percentage of the cost of living in each region. And what's interesting, right, is I didn't put it here, but the highest wage is actually a 7-county metro. But when you include it with the cost of living, it makes up the smallest percentage of the cost of living. The more rural we get, we tend to see lower wages, but the lower cost of living make up for that, where actually that lower wage makes up a significant higher percentage of the cost of living. Again, I think all of us would love to see this be 100% across the board, but it's not. So that's just where we're at. But this is healthcare support. And again, EDR5, not as high as our most rural areas, right around that 90%. Okay, so now a lot of dots. Don't get confused. Don't try and look too much into this. What we're showing here is every occupation included by the occupational employment statistics. And it's the median wage of those occupations in each region of Minnesota, including EDR5. Now, what you'll see is the red dot, the 7-county metro, has a higher median hourly wage for almost nearly every occupation, right? So management occupations, it's way out here by, $60, $70 an hour. EDR5 here, you're right around $38 an hour, right? Pretty low. You're seeing it all across the board here. 7-county metro's highest here. And that's not unexpected, right? I think we all know if we work in the 7-county metro, we get a higher wage. And this just clearly shows that across most of the board. There are a few kind of outliers, protective services being one, where you get paid a little bit more, interestingly so. Okay, so this next chart is going to be all these dots again, but just like before, I'm going to take these median wages as a percentage of the cost of living to kind of see what that looks like. And here we go. So what's interesting, right? Here's the 100%. So if that median wage makes up 100% of the cost of living, this is what it looks like. The big thing that should jump out here is that red dot, that 7-county metro, which was when we looked at median wages to the right of all the regions, now is almost largely to the left. If not to the left, at least significantly closer or within the group of rural regions. And again, we got EDR5 here, and it's a little bit of a mixed bag. So like management occupations, I don't know you don't pay well. Yeah, you don't pay your manager and occupations well. Again, pretty low. And then for the rest of them, kind of falling in the middle. Low here for construction and extraction, one of the lowest. Computer and mathematical, one of the lowest, right? So it's kind of interesting to see where you fall. Again, doing better than you would if you lived in the 7-county metro to some extent, but not as well as if you were just firmly rural. EDR5 continues to fall right in the middle of not paying as high of wages while also not seeing super low cost of living. You kind of just fall in the middle there across the board. And this is the last, my last slide. So this just kind of looks at it statewide. Again, to the left here, the median monthly wage among all occupations, if we were to take that whole data set. And you can see, unsurprisingly, that the largest median monthly wage among all occupations is in the 7-county metro here. And again, you guys are kind of right in that you're not super high as far as median monthly wage. But when we include cost of living, you can see that, you know, we're on the left here, we had all the dark blue, the highest wages be concentrated in 7-county metro. That dark blue as a percentage of cost of living really spreads out. And you see it be relatively fair across the board. But again, you guys north of the Twin Cities and into the Central Lakes, not quite as good as you would see in western and southern reaches of Minnesota. So with that, I will end questions. I'll stop sharing my screen. I'm happy to talk about this. I know some stuff I will not know.
First, Kelly, can we just thank you so much for this presentation? You know, when we first looked at the data, we were looking at it going, are we reading this correctly? Is this exactly what we're seeing for central Minnesota? And it paints a picture. I'd love for team members to chime in, but it seems to me that much the same way you would think about revitalizing or igniting a business, you have only a couple of options. One, to reduce the cost of living, right? And or to increase the salaries, or both. And so it's, you either have more income or less expenses. That's economies, right? So I'd love to hear from team members, and then later from commissioners and businesses as we ask the region to respond to this data. What would be ideas that we could think about on a regional scale that would do some of those things? Because I don't know about you guys, but I'm not loving the position we're in central Minnesota. It's not giving us a lot of high outlook to be competitive on even a statewide, let alone national and global scale, which is what we need to be. So thoughts around other ideas that address that cost of living or our quality of life and or increasing salaries, or other thoughts?
You know, one thing I think is curious, Cheryl, is your region in particular is positioned where, particularly the southern part, is close enough to the Twin Cities to me it be somewhat commutable, not in an everyday sense, but into a new day sense where a lot more people are telecommuting, right? Your region may make sense for a lot of folks because there's still easy transportation to get back to their work if they're telecommuting with a company in the Twin Cities. I bring this up because what that is going to do is that's going to put added pressure on your employers in your region to increase their wages because they have to compete with folks in the Twin Cities. And we've heard this from a number of employers now. I think just north of your guys' region, there was an employer that talked to us saying, you know, when COVID hit and all the turmoil in the Twin Cities, there was a lot more interest in our region. We had this husband and wife that wanted to move to our region, and we hired them both. We were really excited. They went back to the Twin Cities to tell their employer they're out. And that employer said, no, go ahead and move there, but you can keep your job here. You can just telecommute. And that wage was, you know, 10 to 15% higher than what they got offered by the employer in that region. And so the employer was like, well, I don't know what to do, right? Do I increase my wages, or do I just allow this to happen? And so there is going to be a little bit of, as that shift continues, which we think it will, there's going to be this natural kind of push for employers that they're no longer competing for labor amongst their neighbor firms, but now firms that are paying more in the Twin Cities and other places. On the other hand, we're also hearing that Twin Cities employers are like, oh, you want to go live in a rural area? You can do that and telecommute, but we're going to pay you 10% less than when you lived here. We've been hearing that too. So it's going to get interesting, but I think that trend is worth looking at because it's going to push a couple different levers going in the next 2 to 5 years.
Ideas or additional trends that you're seeing, team members?
I'll piggyback off of what Kelly just said. I know my mother-in-law, she moved up to Garrison this last year, but she has her same job that she had in Coon Rapids, which is in the metro. And then my best friend's parents, both of them, they moved up to Grand Rapids, and they both kept their same jobs down in the cities. Big corporations, as far as I know, no salary changes, and it's been very seamless. I believe my buddy's daddy has to go in the office once a week, but that's not a terrible commute. So that's just, I've seen it firsthand, and I know my parents are also trending to move north as well. So
doesn't that create an interesting economy? Whereas people will be moving here and maybe paying taxes, right? And paying into the local units of government. So our municipal services, health and safety services may not be impacted as a result of more people paying property taxes. That said, the people that live here may be living in steeper poverty, those that are from here, right? If they're not able to compete for wages and the cost of living is high and our wages are low, at least within the region, that's an interesting future for us in that local units of government, Kelly, when you talked about policy at least, and their role in policy may not see a dramatic need to make those policy decisions because frankly, their taxes are being paid. And taxes are still coming in from people that are moved here as a result of broadband investments, as a result of housing. And so that's, although it's not as affordable, they can move to anywhere else around us in the state and have more affordable housing. That's an interesting future for us, is what I'm saying. Whereas those that are here may be forced to leave as a result of the lower wages for like type jobs.
It's very similar to what's kind of happened in England in some of those places. They call it rural gentrification, right? So it's been happening in other parts of the world to some extent in Minnesota because we've had lakes regions and kind of cabin-y type cultures, which can add to that rural gentrification. But now we're seeing it to the extent where it's extending beyond the lakes. But there's just people that are like, hey, I can afford to live out here, right? While at the same time increasing the demand for things such as housing. And so that's why we're starting to see an increase in housing. And what's interesting, I'm on city council here in London, our housing values went up by the assessors by 8%. We actually lowered our tax rate because the values went up so much that we were just like, well, we don't need this much money. We had to decrease our tax rate just to kind of be like, yeah, we're good. That's just unheard of. And so these are very new times. And again, it's that kind of supply and demand issue. If everybody's trying to move to a rural area, you take up all the housing, values go up in a hurry just because of market demand. So
it's just shocking me about quality of life. And I'd love for somebody, because I'm thinking about, okay, so like my daughter works for a company out of the metro area and she lives in Arizona, and that's happening more and more, right? As you said, those folks are moving. But when they move to an area and you get folks that'll move here as a result of broadband and they can do their jobs from any other, metro place and get great salaries, they expect services. I'm not talking health and human services. I'm talking about restaurants. And those restaurants and those retail operations that they want to go shop at, we pay lower. So people that want to come here, we're less likely come here if they can't have the amenities that they're expecting, because we don't have the populations that'll actually work at those low-level jobs. One, they can't afford it because our cost of living is too high, right? Incomparable to the hourly rates. And so I have a tendency to want to go towards reducing cost of living. And I think the market's going to have to adjust to increasing salaries, or people that can get more money from jobs in the metro will move here and have increased salaries. But reducing the cost of living seems like our food costs through our local food store can be reduced, can we address the transportation issues and lower the transportation costs, like through the RTCC, Rural Transportation Councils, to do more affordable transportation. It just, I'm gonna end there. Somebody else please chime in.
Yeah, I just had a question. I mean, I'm curious, you were just talking about the UK and that they've been through this rural gentrification you were talking about. I was just curious if this is newer in our area, are there like other models that we can learn from in other places? I know it's not exactly the same, but I'm curious to learn more about that, or if there has been success stories other places to learn a bit more from too.
It's a good question. Everybody asks what are best practices, right? I don't know. I haven't really dug too far into that. I apologize. No, I'm not even going to try. Although I will say, like, one of the big things, if you're going to try and make an impact on supply and demand, right? So let's talk about housing. Housing developers can still make a profit in rural areas. It's just they can't make as much of a profit in a rural area, right? And so it's always going to draw, where can we make the biggest bang for our buck? But in my mind, we did this in New London. We found a local developer that was willing to, you know what, I know I'm not going to make as much here, but you guys need housing. It's a sure thing. The city government's kind of, or the EDA's backing it. Yeah, I'll develop. And we did a whole bunch of patio style homes, particularly for the elderly that were in single family homes, to try and get them to move out, right? So part of it is like trying to create a little bit of churn in housing and loosen up some of that older housing stock that is there, that's taken up by older folks, to go into something that maybe they want or is more appropriate for them. I can't tell you how many communities I talk to, and they're like, God, we have so many people here that would love a one level, low maintenance house that so they can move out of, but we just can't find anybody to build the darn things or to finance it. And I'm like, find a local developer, talk to your local community bank. They do that kind of stuff. Talk to your EDA. There are ways to do it, but it takes relationships and it takes the talking and the building. Don't just expect to put out a request for proposal and expect anything. It really does require that kind of on the ground work. And that's just housing. I think there's a lot of things like that where there's a ton of opportunity, but local people just need to kind of get some skin in the game and take it on. So.
With that, I think we'll end our session, guys, unless anyone has a burning question or thought or comment. No, okay. And we will offer opportunity, Kelly, to gather questions either from our commissioners when we post this in our and in CETA Full Corp, and bring some of those questions back to you if you don't mind. And likewise, that would be wonderful for us to be able to do that with our private sector folks as well, if they have specific questions, that we can be a repository for those questions. Yeah, and I appreciate your comments about how local communities really need to just prioritize and then figure out who to partner with to make some of those changes happen. But fascinating data, like really, really timely for us as we think about our work, our agency's work, our role, and also all of our partners out there. So, wow, thank you. Any other comments? Lots of thank yous in the chat, and we can stop recording now.